I'm your host, Jon Enos, and this is, I believe, I'm calling it episode 4. I've already lost track. So, I did start out with an outline of sorts, a sort of kind of grand master plan of kind of how I wanted to structure these opening episodes before we get into the interview shows. But I knowing myself, left that outline fairly loose. And thank goodness I did, because things are already changing. I'm having to kind of respond to requests and feedback. So last episode, I inserted a special unplanned episode, just me telling more war stories, more resistance stories and things that I grew up and heard with. Because I realized that a bunch of people had never heard them. Even some people in my family had not heard those stories from their parents, because I'm the oldest and the youngest, 20 years difference, right? So I want to go back and pick up some thoughts from episode 2 about neurodivergence. And I've entitled this rap, Hello Mother, Hello Father. Now, that title, for me, immediately evokes a memory from my childhood. So my childhood, I have to say, I lived a Stranger Things childhood. I was Stranger Things. So me and my buddies, nerds in the 70s, riding our bikes around our, suburban neighborhood, playing Dungeons and Dragons in each other's basements. And then we went even deeper. We got into all kinds of psychic experimentation. We were reading books about astral travel and telepathy, and we were conducting experiments, double blind and all these things, and coming up with amazing results. And we were living quite the secret lives that our parents didn't even know about, stuff we didn't talk about. So talk about, and diversity in the group. So we're all nerds, neurodivergent, brainiac nerds, basically outcasts. One was a born-again Christian, Southern Baptist, if I believe. I was effectively born-again Christian. I was Mormon, which is born-again Christianity with some extra esotericism dropped on top. Then we had a couple just straight atheist scientist nerds. And then we had a Wiccan. We had a practicing witch, basically. He was doing magic spells and coming up with some pretty powerful evidence. And we were exploring this stuff. We were experimenting. We were reading books, setting up experiments, and doing them. All the while our parents thought we were just playing Dungeons and Dragons in the basement. It's like, it's a crazy life. Anyway, I grew up in the age of vinyl records. We absolutely put platters on cheap turntables in moldy basements in the Midwest, in Missouri, right? That's how the very first time I heard Van Halen play. Big brother, older brother of one of my friends, come here, guys, I want to blow your mind. Took us down to the moldy basement, into his dank, dark, basement room, where he had this little tabletop turntable, and he dropped the needle on Van Halen, on Eddie playing Eruption or Spanish Fly or something. And that was my introduction to, that kind of music. Yeah. Stranger Things days. But one of the things that was really, really big back then was comedy albums. And, we didn't, this is pre-YouTube. We didn't have internet. We didn't have any, you had to, it was hard to get material that you liked. You had to see things live, or you could do vinyl recordings. So we listened to comedians on vinyl recordings. And there was a guy back then called Alan Sherman. And he had a huge hit. His shtick was he would do funny songs, kind of, like Frank Zappa stuff. But he was, a stand-up comedian do these hilarious lyrics. And one of his classics that we listened to over and over and over again was Hello Mother, Hello Father. And I don't know copyright. I'm not going to do much of a clip, but I'll sing the opening lines, because they've stuck in my mind since I was, 12 or whatever it was. So it was, hello, mother. Hello, father. Here I am at Camp Granada. Camp is very entertaining. They say we'll have some fun if it ever stops raining. And then he goes on and on and on. Now, I did not have to look up those lyrics. I did not have to relearn them. I did not have to practice this before turning record on. Not that song has stuck in my mind ever since. Go YouTube it. He's on YouTube. You can listen to it. It's fabulous. He goes on. The whole letter. It's him singing his letter to his parents from summer camp, and he's saying how terrible it is, the entire letter. And then right at the end, the very last verse, the sun comes out, the sky is blue, everybody's playing, it's wonderful. Forget coming to get me. I'm going to stay at camp, right? So it ends on a high note. But hello, mata, hello, fada. When I was originally talking about, neurodiversity, already having some challenges in sensory integration and the way your brain processes stress, then there's trauma on top of that, things that happen to you that create new triggers and new traumas that you then have to confront and deal with. But there's also this concept of generational trauma, the stuff we inherit directly from hello mata, hello fada. The baggage that they carried when we were born and being raised, and the things that then, the cycles that then perpetuate generation to generation to generation. For example, I happen to know and have personally met 4 generations of my family bloodlines on either side. So great-grandparents on my dad's side, a great-grandparent on my mom's side. And I happen to know that both sides of the family, for at least 4 generations, experienced some forms of violence or other trauma, deprivation, hunger, stress, war, right? Something within those generations, both sides. That every generation had some interaction with high stress situations. My parents came not just from hard, rugged lineages. I've already told stories in another place of, my grandmother, my mother's mother, using her pregnancy with my mom to smuggle food across the Nazi lines, right? Pretty high stress. Well, my grandmother on my dad's side, my dad's mom, Mildred Lynch, who I knew well, right? She didn't die till I think I was 17. When she was 8 years old, she and her family moved from Tennessee to Texas in a covered wagon, which she walked behind because at 8 years old, she was to tend the livestock. That was her job. She tended all the animals that weren't currently pulling the carts. She was tending them. And they would make, very little mileage a day, 5 to 8 miles a day. And they went. And she had vivid memories of that childhood of basically Wild West conditions. When I knew her in the summer of 1977, she was working for NASA and driving a convertible Mustang, listening to a Steve Miller Band on her cassette tape player, driving 80 miles an hour in Houston, Texas. Like, she lived in 2 worlds. She lived in literally the Wild West and literally the space age in one lifetime, a relatively brief lifetime that ended early from cancer, right? Amazing, the lives that people very close to me actually lived. So I think about these generations, right? The things we bring down with us, our generational experiences. Now, my mother, as I've already told, was a war baby. Effectively, both my parents were war babies, right? And one thing that I learned later with research is that there's some very interesting research about stress under wartime conditions. So for example, to step back, one of my mother's heroines was Audrey Hepburn. She loved Audrey Hepburn. And it makes sense. Audrey Hepburn was an amazing person, delightful human being, and a very popular actress in her day. Superstar. But additionally, my mother looks like Audrey Hepburn. We are drawn to, they say we couple with, and we are drawn to, and even our pets, we like what reflects us, right? And that which seems to be us, My mother was a young Audrey Hepburn. You can just see it in the photographs. And so she adored Audrey Hepburn. Well, it turns out they had some interesting things in common. Ms. Hepburn was, maybe 10 years older than my mother. So whereas my mom was an infant under wartime conditions, under occupation, Audrey Hepburn was a young teenager. And where it was my grandmother who was sneaking around and lying to their Nazi guards and doing life-threatening things. In Audrey Hepburn's life, it was actually her. Not a lot of people know, but Audrey Hepburn's family actually was part of a underground railroad that helped people escape in the Dutch children, Holland, the Netherlands, I think, and so she lived under high stress conditions. And then she was also part, I believe it was 1944 and 1945. There was an active famine in the Netherlands during the war because of supply chain disruption in the war, and people were dying. I mean, I know famines happen all over the world, but it's rare that they happen in the quote-unquote first world, and in Europe with well-to-do people. So Audrey Hepburn was part of that generation that was under extreme deprivation from malnutrition and extreme stress. Those kids later became part of a study, which was controversial in itself, but a study which first got people thinking about a concept which is now known as epigenetics. So, I don't pretend to really understand this, so please Google if you're interested in the details. But broadly speaking, previously we thought like genetics from one generation, things pass to the next, but that the germline, the actual genes that are in the sperms and the eggs are relatively fixed throughout your life, and that's that. But we now realize partly from the studies of these kids, the Dutch famine kids, including Audrey Hepburn, is that there began to be evidence that there were, how to summarize this? Basically, stress in the mother's life can trigger gene expressions on or off that change the genetic inheritance of her kids because of the stress she is experiencing in real time in her life. So it's a direct heritability of certain aspects, usually related to trauma, that get encoded in the gene line that's directly passed from mother to child. So stress in the mother's prenatal life, or before she has given birth, directly impacts her children, which then of course impacts downline, and that this can take generations, right? So a famine timed particularly correctly in your mother's life or your grandmother's life can have direct impact on you and your genetic makeup and tolerance to stress, and might have disadvantaged you. There's some evidence that this can take generations to work itself out in various populations. So my mother definitely had that. So she was neurodivergent to begin with. She had inherited this kind of high stress, prenatal, natal, and early childhood stress. Her mother had experienced extreme stress prior to her conception, right? And so the conditions were correct for her to basically have a fairly disadvantaged mental health crapshoot at birth. Well, my father as well was more or less a war baby, born under conditions of stress. And his mother, this amazing woman who I've already praised, who had a big impact on my life, but she was not particularly well suited to motherhood. And she became also neurodivergent, like amazing. Like she was an entrepreneur. When I knew her as a retiree, she had 5 different businesses that she ran out of her garage. She was wheeling and dealing in real estate and all this stuff. She was just an incredibly amazing woman, but also neurodivergent, prone to explosive rages, which then my father inherited, and was also prone to explosive rages, which then conditioned me, and I was prone to explosive rage, right? My mother as well went through the same situation. So already kind of fractured and broken. She was born into a home where there was alcoholism and anger and fighting in the home and physical violence in the home, right? So super, super high stress childhood in her early life. And then in my father, his mother became so stressed, so his dad traveled a lot and then was also gone to the war. He served in World War II, so I've told some stories about him previously. She became completely overwhelmed while my father was an infant, and when he would cry, instead of knowing how to soothe him, she would lay him in a drawer of a chest of drawers and close the drawer, close him up in a cabinet drawer until he stopped crying. So he was suffering, unbeknownst to her, who was also suffering. He suffered those earliest childhood abandonment issues that then left him with all kinds of terrible attachment issues in his psychology and behavior and personality that impacted him throughout the remainder of his life. So both of my parents started out with a lottery of not great conditions for excellent mental health or excellent communication skills or coping skills. You know, there's this... My spirituality has been really profoundly affected by Native American wisdom, and I've done a lot of study and had some teachers in indigenous traditions. And there's several of them that have the concept that if you heal yourself, you also heal your generations. 7 generations back, 7 generations forward, right? This kind of sound wave of healing goes back and forth through your ancestry, your bloodline, and it's taken literally in many contexts. And there's some really interesting modern work, I believe, called family constellation therapy, I think, but it's kind of fusing that mythic archetype of indigenous work with modern psychology techniques, and it's sort of a role play situation where you come to terms with some of your generational trauma and, you know, affect profound healing in your generation, but they actively engaged with the concept that you're also healing forwards and backwards, that you're providing a service, that your efforts towards self-healing are a benefit to your family. Basically, that's what I'm saying. And I believe that. Like, I've seen evidence of that. I have seen, as I've worked on my own and as other individuals in the family have worked on their own mental health, everything seems to be better. Even our memories of the past seem to improve, as if we are rewriting in a non-linear time sense what has gone before, changing our own history through healing in the present. It's an interesting notion. So that's part of the theme of this episode, that when we come from highly stressed generations, and we all do, really, frankly, that miasma of hurt, pain, which leads into behaviors, negative neuroexpressions, negative communication patterns, and then in trying to self-medicate that, substance abuse, because it's a crutch for these issues. But when we can break that chain, that cycle, generation after generation after generation learning, they say that tradition in my line, the Enos line, is that each generation has been significantly less violent than the one previous to it, right? I'm more or less a pacifist. I've studied martial arts. There are weapons in my home for reasons which we will discuss, but that's because of the way the world is. My preference is peace and love, man. Obviously, I'm an old hippie, right? I'm about the love. My dad had a very, very hot anger, worse than mine, which is hard to believe if you knew me even not that long ago. But yeah, very explosive, but he might toss some things, but he never struck people. He never, it was just kind of impotent violence, right? His dad was a knockdown, drag-out fighter, pugilist, and not afraid to go hardcore with a hickory stick if need be, right? His father, there's a famous story that he and his wife, so we're now at my great-grandfather and great-grandmother, kept each other at bay in a shotgun battle that lasted all day long. She was in a ditch across the street, and he was hunkered down on the porch in front of the family house, and they both had a box of shells and kept each other pinned, shouting, cursing, and shooting all day long till they ran out of ammunition. And this was laughed at told comically as a family myth on my side, and on it goes, right? You go one further generation back, and that's the frontier, the wild frontier, and we're talking, some pretty intense lives. So, that's an improvement, but unless you really get in there and dig in and engage and start to heal, like, there's all this stuff that you never recognize. Now, I've been able to tell some great stories about my parents here previous to this episode. And I'm very glad. And I've had people already sending in comments saying, my father featured heavily in my 30 microns of gold, my value of impermanence video. And I had people write, said, your father was so wise to teach you that and various things. And it's true. He was. And then my mother has featured prominently in the 3 Wonderful Germans video. And so many of you have acknowledged, and rightly so, how wonderful your mother and grandmother, what a badass your grandma was, which is true. My grandmother, my French grandmother, who fought in the resistance and smuggled food across Gestapo lines, at 70, in her 70s, she lived with us in my parents' home. And she was going out in her 70s dancing to dance clubs in Houston, Texas, in a leather miniskirt. See ya. Amazing people, tough people. Oh my God. Hopefully this story is not disturbing. I think it's funny, but so my father's mother, Mildred, the one who crossed in a wagon and then drove Mustangs later in life, and as I say, drove sports cars and owned businesses. This power woman, my dad's mom, and Yvonne, my mom's mom, power woman from Europe, power woman from Texas, who did have their differences and did fight, but towards the end of their lives, there kind of was this unity. Well, my father's mother had a mastectomy from breast cancer. Eventually it came back, and she did die of cancer, but she was in a good place at that point. And then my French grandmother, who was, a rock star and very healthy and tough into her 80s. So my dad's mom had a fake breast, and my mom's mom had natural breast. And at some point, I was 15, and it was a different time, and these were, women of a certain age. They cornered me, and they said, you'll know, 15-year-old Randy boy. They said, feel, and one grabbed one hand and put it on her fake boob, and one grabbed the other hand and put it on her real boob, and they said, which is better? And I'm standing there with my 2 grandmothers going, they're both amazing grandmas. Oh! Yeah, these were the women that birthed my parents and reared them into the world. Tough women, hard women, women who made choices that were often based on survival, and that made choices that injured their children, who then were traumatically disadjusted and created an environment that injured us, their children, right? On it went. My parents, they were beautiful, they were gorgeous, they literally were James Dean and Audrey Hepburn. I'll flash a photo on if I can find it and figure out how to integrate it into this video, but they were. And my mother was drawn to him because of a fantasy. My mother was always a romantic. She loved cinema. Crazy for cinema. In fact, one of the great joys of her life is that later in life, some of her children got successful enough in the entertainment industry that she was able to meet stars, people that she admired and loved, and have quality interactions with, people who were important to her, I mean, Brad Pitt bought my mom some perfume, Joe Malone, that she loved, indirectly through my sister, and she got to have dinner with Sam Shepard, and things like that she talked about as that made her very, very happy. And because she grew up with cinema being, this is the early days, of big cinema. She fell in love with James Dean, watching Giant on the big screen on the French Riviera in Nice, France. She just saw it 3 or 4 times with her friends, and then shortly thereafter, James Dean was killed racing sports cars on a stretch of lonely highway in California, which I have driven many times. She was so distraught by the death of James Dean, a movie star from California. She wept. She remembered, said her and her friends would just weep and hug over this James Dean. And then she met this heartthrob American, tall, handsome Texan, just like Giant. In Giant, James Dean plays a Texan oil baron family. I don't know. I think maybe I've seen the movie years ago. Don't remember everything about it. But yeah, he's a Texan. And so she just falls in love with my dad archetypally because he was a young, handsome Texan, and that was somehow romantic because a tragic movie star that she loved. Right? You just see, it was just a fantasy of archetypes. They didn't know how to talk to each other. They were culturally very different, and they fought for the next 50 years. They stayed married, but they fought like cats and dogs for 50 years, and yet died within 6 months of each other because they didn't know how to be apart. Right? So they were wounded too. And for a long time, my relationship with both of my parents was broken. It was, triggered because I could not see or respect or appreciate the narrative that I've tried to create today, a narrative that gives them an out, a narrative that explains, maybe doesn't excuse, but explains why they were not always able to be parents that could create a safe environment that could particularly coddle an already neurodivergent, highly reactive, highly emotional kid. And so as it was, they screaming and yelling and bad boundaries and all of that, it left a damaging atmosphere that I'm now able to forgive and understand because I see my damage, my neurodiversity, my anger, my not very healthy responses and behavior patterns. Many of them were learned. I'm so genetically similar to my dad. I mean, one of the last times I saw him when I visited him a few months before his death, he had been sleeping, but he instructed my sister, he had told her before he went to bed, he said, I'm going to take a nap, but as soon as John gets here, come in, wake me up, please. So that's what we did. She brought me into the bedroom, and I kind of leaned down over him to wake him up. Hey, Dad. And as his eyes opened and focused, and he saw my face a few inches above his eyes lit up, and he said, almost in a childish way, he said, my twin. Which he had never called me that before, and I realized in that moment that, yeah, we're astonishingly similar in looks and mannerism, gestures, and behaviors. Not necessarily all good, right? So forgiving him and trying to figure out him has also been really healing for me because I'm figuring myself out as well. And it wasn't just mental health that plagued my parents. They were plagued by physical health. My dad in particular, he started getting sick really in his 30s. I remember a spell where he had an eruption of horrible boils that burst out on his back, and he had to sit in the sunlight, and my mom would have to put this, awful concoction on his sores till they healed. But what that apparently was the first wave expression of what they called a rare psoriatic arthritis. Arthritis is basically it's autoimmune disease where your body immune system is fighting itself. But his was the skin and connective tissues, particularly, I think. And so psoriasis, so skin eruptions, but then also joint pain and all kinds of other things. He started to suffer really badly in his 40s and progressively bad throughout the rest of his life. Well, what he did was he couldn't really afford medications. So what he did is he signed up to be a lab rat, basically, an experimental test subject for drugs in development for these diseases. The thinking was, well, I get free medication and doctor help I don't have to pay for. And then I might actually be helping myself and be helping others. Well, unfortunately, some of those experimental drugs I don't even know if they're used anymore, methyltrexates and steroids and other things. And they really changed his personality. They really impacted him. It had in a negative way. And even when he stopped taking the majority of them, I think it put him on a track that he never really recovered from. And he spiraled into a state of mental health which is often paranoid and angry and reactive and passive aggressive, etc., etc. What we call in the South a dry drunk, kind of drunken behavior. But he was a teetotaler. He was a Mormon. He didn't drink, but he had very alcoholic-like behaviors, unexpected rages and explosions, and hostility out of nowhere and things like that. But it was all because of his inner wounds. My mother the same. Tremendous pressures and stresses, and then immigrating to a new country, having the language barrier, but then also the cultural barriers, feeling like she was judged and looked down on everywhere she went. She was the weirdo, and yet having her own flipped, like she looked down on everyone. She was the French pride, and everything Texan was low rent, right? So it was this, fighting with my dad, and then having a genuinely, difficult, they were poor, raising kids, struggling. So she did the best they could. They did the best they could. They both did. They did the best they could. And they created an environment that for me was so triggering that I had to distance myself from my parents for large periods of time. I left home at 17, popped in and out for a couple of years till I got my bearings on income, and then rarely went back. Over time, I did an experiment, and I realized that if I could keep a visit with my parents down to about 3 days, we were almost guaranteed we could get through it with no drama, with no fights, with no arguments, and have a good time. But if it was anything above that, and if it was a week or more, it was absolutely guaranteed that there would be, at some point, somehow, for some reason, a major explosion, a fight, drama, a hurt feeling, or something that would leave emotional repercussions. Guaranteed. Any visit a week or longer. Over my entire adult lifetime, and I have receipts and statistics. There are very few exceptions. One exception was when my dad came to see, I think, the last play he saw me in, comedy, and we had a good trip. That was a good one. A few other exceptions, but only a handful, 2 or 3, not even handful, 2 or 3 exceptions to that rule over life. I had to keep my distance from people I loved because they triggered me so much that I just dropped back into my juvenile self, became a 17-year-old, and raged right back at them, right? Just in this uncontrollable explosion, and then shut down, and then they would shut down, right? So, if I'm autistic, my dad was way autistic. He would explode at you. You'd scream back. And then he would completely shut down, that autistic shutdown, in self-loathing, beating himself up for his behavior, but then he couldn't correct it, and he couldn't apologize either. He couldn't fix it. So every time he'd cause some damage, he hurt himself. He knew he didn't want to hurt us. He didn't know how to stop it. And same with me. And when my children were young, I was a rager. I broke my marriage in large part because of my anger response, which is directly attached to my fear body, my existential anxiety fear thing that I would cover up by anger, strength, right? But that was a crutch, a defense, a shield from what was really going on, which is just pain, just trauma, just trigger, right? Learning that about myself has been hugely powerful in my being able to forgive and understand my parents, who didn't have the support, didn't have the vocabulary, didn't have the social network to engage with and do their own healing until quite late in life, and by then, it was quite late. Here's a paradox. It's something we're going to come back to again and again. It's a meta theme in my life and my armchair philosophy, and a thread I want to explore through this show, particularly when we get to interviews. And that is the paradox itself, the concept of paradox, which is that two seemingly opposite things can coexist, live together at the same time. And that in complex systems such as nature, the world, reality, mental health, etc., we are bound to get to situations that include paradox. And so in honoring and loving my parents and telling their stories and the best things, the best lessons that they gave me in my life, I must also acknowledge that they contributed to an environment that left me wounded and damaged, and that drove me away from them, and my own way of coping was to establish hard boundaries, which cost me time in their presence, which I now have as a regret since they're both gone. But it's also opened up the possibility of healing, not just my relationship with them, but I feel, quite literally, our whole timeline. And if we can heal that, what about those around us? And if everyone is working on that, that's how we heal the world. Heal thyself, physician, and heal thy patient. Heal the world. So I want to explore, or at least, no, for right now, just put out there this concept. I was both loved and harmed by the same people in the same context. My parents, who created a vessel of nurturing, which absolutely forged who I am, also compounded and exacerbated some of the negatives. They hurt me and they helped me. They loved me and they harmed me. They sacrificed for me, and they also made ridiculous demands on me. And they broke boundaries in a way that was not healthy. And then they gave too much, and they gave too little, and they said too much, they said too little. As do we all. All right. Forgiving them is part of forgiving myself, but also understanding that each of us probably have the same narrative. That our parents had it worse than we did, and their parents had it worse than they did, and on and on. And even if that's the reverse, like for example, Santia's family, the mother of my children, you go back 3 generations, they were quite wealthy, and they had a series of setbacks and loss. So by the time she was around, the family was relatively not well off, but like 4 generations before had been. And sometimes that's the tragedy. The tragedy of falling from grace in a generation creates a horrible miasma. Or the fact of generational poverty creates, right? It's almost like you can't win, right? No matter what situation there is, abundance or deprivation, there's going to be some traumas in there, right? Somehow. It's the pain point we have to dig in with and deal with and engage with and fix. Acknowledge, challenge, push away, deal with. Right? And I think that can happen. I am my dad. I am. I'm him. And healing myself is also healing my relationship. I am my mother. I am her. And even though it's quite obvious to everyone in my life that all of my important female relationships are me just trying to figure out my relationship with my mom, still ongoing. I mean, I talked to this. I'm constantly falling in love with archetypes of my mother, regardless of their age or marital status or even gender, right? And I'm constantly falling in love with father figures, right? I've worked for the same man for 14 years, who's 15 years older than me, right? Father figure, et cetera, in my life. And I adopt sons. Because of my wounded relationship and experience with my own son, right? We do this in our relations. And at least when we become aware, there can be some healing that goes along with this. All right. That's the philosophy part. I want to end by reading a couple essays, reading basically eulogies that I wrote for my parents. A short eulogy I wrote for my dad shortly after his death, and then a slightly longer one that I wrote for my mom. It's the loss of parents, especially when I felt like there was unfinished business, is challenging. But I kind of do believe the all's well that ends well, and maybe it's just my personality that I'm open to forgiveness as a concept. I feel like deathbed repentance counts, My father was never able to say I'm sorry except one time after his first heart attack, about 8 years before he died. He actually said the words. And I accepted that, right? That was good enough. It was an attempt. And that doesn't always fly. Not everyone. My brother doesn't necessarily agree with that. He just says, no, he doesn't get a pass. Just, I respect both sides and both positions. But for me, I chose to look at my dad like, so I'm a nerd. I'm a Tolkien nerd. I read fantasy and science fiction. Love Lord of the Rings. There's that character, and this is actually particularly poignant in the films too, if you just read the films. Theoden King, the king of Rohan, he's been under a spell. He's been under a tragic curse for years. Saruman has infected his mind and is manipulating him and has sent him this worm-tongue advisor to manipulate. And they've destroyed the kingdom, and all these terrible, tragic things have happened. But it's because he was ill. It's because he was cursed. It was because he was under a spell. And Gandalf comes and takes his staff and, be gone. Heals him. And in the last year of his life, in the last few months, he's able to heroically defend and ultimately save, be a part of the salvation of his people. And as he is lying on the battlefield there, and that actually beautifully acted scene, beautifully written, beautifully acted and shot scene, the death of Theoden on the plain after the fight there, Pelennor Field. No, it's not. Is it? Yeah. Anyway, he says, I am now basically, I wish I had memorized the words, but he's like, I'm going to now sit at the table of my forebears, in whose noble company I am no longer ashamed to be in. Right? He says, I feel like he had felt ashamed of his reign, but in his last few weeks, he was able to correct all of that went before, and now sits with his forefathers unashamed. That archetype resonates very much for me, thinking of my dad. My dad was cursed with poor mental health and poor physical health, and the bad luck to get allopathic medicines intervening in that physical health that dramatically impacted for the worse his mental health, again, in a vicious loop. So he was trapped in a body that did not allow him to express his soul to its full measure. And I remember him as a young man. I remember him when he was full of life, an educator, a historian, a thinker, a philosopher, a bit of a radical, a rebel, a teacher, incredible lecturer, storyteller, passionate. But that's not who he ended as being. And I'm afraid some of even my siblings have no idea really who he was as a younger man, and that's too bad. But like Theoden King, at the end, I think, he kind of went out in a bit of a blaze of glory, trying to heal the wake of traumas he'd left behind him. And I think he was proud to meet his forebears, which he had some tough men to live up to, and he didn't feel like he could, I don't think. So anyway, these are some words I wrote for and about him just days after his death. Dear friends, after several happy days of feeling really good, celebrating an early birthday, eating his favorite foods, chocolate cake, mashed potatoes, and a chili dog, and laughing at a joke Raphael made right before bed, I'm confiscating your scooter so you don't elope. Our papa died in the night. He was almost 80 years old and had battled congestive heart failure for about 8 years. His wife of half a century preceded him by 6 months, and his oldest grandson by a few weeks. He was a complicated man who had a difficult life. He suffered chronic illness from his 30s onward. He loved his family more than anything, but was of a generation and a temperament that made expressing that love terribly difficult for him. I shared his name, his face, and much of his personality. I stayed away from him for years at a time because we were too much alike. The last time I saw him was a very good visit. After his first heart attack, he spent what remained of his life, often clumsily, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, trying to repair the damage he had done in his most important relationships. He was mostly successful, and I forgive the rest. Every day was his birthday. Jon Enos, May 4th, 1940, February 8, 2020. Now, My mother's death was much more complicated and much more emotional. She was ill with a rare blood cancer. I apologize, I forget the name. I think it's EV. It's like a leukemia, but your marrow produces too many white blood cells and your blood thickens up like a milkshake, slows everything down, and you're prone to heart attack, brain fog, all kinds of things. They can't cure it, but they can manage it with medications. Problem is, my mother didn't really talk about it. We knew she was taking medication, but she said, oh, it's for high blood pressure, which technically was true, but she didn't really explain that she had been diagnosed with a fatal disease that she was managing. We didn't realize how quite serious it was. In midsummer of 2019, she appears to have become confused, which is a symptom, and stopped taking her meds and had a heart attack in August of 2019. From August of 2019 till the next March, we experienced 4 funerals and a wedding. That's an essay I'll read for another time, and a story I'll tell for another time. But it was pretty intense, and her death was really a shock because we didn't realize how sick she was, didn't realize how important the medication was. Right? We weren't monitoring it for her, and as she became confused, she experienced an untimely death. But as I've explained before, I had a very complicated relationship with her, and so here are some of the thoughts that I share. An essay, a eulogy for my mother that I wrote right after her death in August of 2019. Tuesday, August 6th. My phone is 76% charged. My mother was 76 years old, if I got the math right. She didn't like math. She didn't like talking about her age. She refused to let anyone plan a party for her 70th. Black balloons were strict verboten, which is a joke because she was French and not German. My mother and I shared a birthday, almost. I'm the 9th, she the 11th, both in November. Scorpios, dark, intense, complicated. 11 November is VE Day, the Allied victory in Europe. She would stand on her apartment balcony as a kid and wave at the parades, pretending that all of Europe was celebrating her birth. Tonight, we celebrate her life. Here's the story. Our mother, Monique Jon Enos, passed away suddenly on Tuesday evening, August 6th. She was being treated for rare blood cancer. She seems to have become confused, a symptom of the disease, and stopped taking her medication. In the end, it was probably a heart attack. It's customary for my family to laugh as often as possible, regardless of the circumstances. But this one definitely caught us by surprise. Of all the medically fragile people in my life, she was not at the top of my worry list. So you never know. Tell your peeps you love them. Today. Today is all you got. Monique was an educator. She had an impact on many people. She was one of those teachers they make movies about, sad movies like Dead Poets Society and Goodbye, Mr. Chips, both of which she loved, by the way. She aspired not so much to teach French as to change lives. Apparently she succeeded. Dozens of former students and friends have posted memories of her on social media. Monique was very active on Facebook. She created hundreds of photo albums with interesting themes. Looking up, pebbles, arrivals, laughter. Photography was more than a hobby for her. She embraced the role of family archivist almost as a spiritual practice. The family albums she created, the virtual ones on Facebook, as well as bookshelves full of handmade real ones in our private collection, formed a not insignificant part of her life purpose. She created a literal wall of photos in our family home. So when Facebook came along, creating a virtual wall just seemed the most natural thing in the world. My mother and I had a complicated relationship, but just a few months ago in the spring, we had a wonderful last visit. Endings are important. She liked arrivals. She didn't like goodbyes. The day before I left, we took a walk together down the old neighborhood street, Skyview Farms. That used to be the name of the whole neighborhood, but bit by bit, chunks of the old farm got sold off and developed. These days, the last remaining acres of farmland are surrounded by subdivisions. As we walked down the road from our house on the corner, the family home from where I left to go adulting into the world nearly 40 years ago, and the house where she died, it felt like we were walking back in time. We walked away from modern brick homes to farmhouses. Down this street, we faded from the city to the country, from the car traffic to the circling flocks of egrets and blue herons startled up from the wet ditches where they hunt for crayfish during the sluggish days. We walked back in time from this quarter-acre plot of South Texas where my mother spent more of her life than anywhere else, into a time when I was 17 and about to leave home for the first time. Her firstborn, leaving the nest, was a very bad time for her, and I didn't do much to help that process. But now we have reversed roles. She has left home for new adventures, and I am trying to figure out how to absorb the reality of my own children getting married and starting careers, still figuring out how to parent while losing a parent. None of us have any idea what we're doing. Generations fumbling blindly towards love. I called my daughters to tell them the news. Sonia and I cried together. Then I called Tadja. No signal, so I left a message. She and Aaron were on a cross-country road trip to a family wedding out in national park country, frequently out of cell service. Our family has always had a thing for road trips. My parents started it. Heck, my dad, with a failing heart himself, did a heroic 1,700 miles by himself just a month before his death. Hitting the open road is archetypal for us. It's like a rebirth in our family, a baptism. Tadja was feeling it. She got my voicemail and she knew it was bad news. She told Aaron, "We need to get to the nearest town with cell signal. I have to call my dad." She called, and I told her. We cried, and then started reminiscing about my mother's life. When I heard they happened to be driving through a scenic part of Utah, it reminded me of an anecdote about my mom. I told Tadja the story that the family that sponsored my mother so that she could get her student visa as part of her process of immigration to America lived in a little town called Green River, Utah. "Dad, get out! Green River, Utah?" Yeah, I said. "No way," she said. "What?" I said. "I'm in Green River right now. Green River, Utah. It was the first town with cell signal. I'm staring at a sign for Green River Diner." So, on the night my mother died, her granddaughter received the news, having randomly landed at the Green River Diner, in the very same town that was my mother's symbolic portal of entry into America. Entering that portal led to her crossing paths again with my father. Crossing paths with him led to my existence, which led, of course, to my daughters. And all of this on a road trip, symbolically dividing the ending of her childhood and education and the birth of her new adult self. For she is just now embarking on that moment in life when there are no longer any predetermined roadmaps or instructions. The true unknown, the undiscovered country. Round and round it goes in cycles and flows, generation after generation, fumbling toward love. In memoriam, Monique Paulette Georgie Enos, November 11th, 1942, August 6th, 2019. I like to end each episode with what I like to call prayer of hope. You know, as intense as some of my stories are and were, I know some of you have experienced much more intense. And where I'm able to begin to tell a story of coming back and healing from trauma, some of you are still deeply within your dark spaces and dark nights of your souls. And I want to acknowledge that and to give a prayer of hope. If my experience is archetypal, and I feel that it is, you can get to a very dark place and still bounce back. There is light at the end of the tunnel. My friends, above the clouds. The sky is blue. It does get better. I send out to you a prayer of hope, healing, forgiveness, self-regulation, self-improvement, spiritual epiphanies, emotional connections, and healed relationships are all possible. They all take work. They all have to be engaged with. It's not easy. There's no 30-second TikTok of 3 best ways to heal your mental health that is actually going to work. It's hard. You got to engage with it. You got to want it. But it's possible. You can heal. I have healed. And I'm holding space for you and anyone who's in a dark place. Hang on. It gets better. There is hope. I love you guys. More to come. Thanks for listening. Leave your own stories below if you'd like, and ciao for now.